Amina was a young girl who had known hardship all her life. She lived in a tiny, broken-down house at the edge of a noisy street where the walls were thin and the wind slipped through the cracks during cold nights. Her father had passed away when she was just a little child, leaving her mother to raise her alone. But her mother had fallen sick years ago, unable to work. And now the weight of survival rested on Amina's small shoulders. Every morning, before the sun even rose, Amina would get up quietly so as not to disturb her mother. She would put on the same faded dress she wore almost every day, the one she had mended over and over with thread that didn't quite match. She would walk through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, offering to sweep, wash clothes, carry groceries, anything that could earn her a few coins. Sometimes she worked for hours and only earned enough to buy a small piece of bread and a handful of rice. Her days were long, but she never complained. She had learned to smile, even when her stomach growled in hunger. On good days, she would come home with some vegetables or a little meat, enough to cook a warm meal for her mother. On bad days, she would drink water, pretending she wasn't hungry so her mother could have the last piece of food. Amina's shoes had holes in them, and when it rained, her feet got wet and cold. The neighborhood children teased her for her old clothes, but she ignored them. Deep inside, she carried a quiet strength of belief that one day, somehow, life could change. But every time she saw her mother coughing, pale and weak, that hope felt a little further away. She loved books, but school was a dream she had given up on. She used to sneak into the back of the local library to read when she had free time. But lately, she was too busy working. She missed the feeling of getting lost in a story. But real life demanded all her attention. One chilly evening, Amina sat by the small window of their home, watching people in fine clothes pass by on their way to restaurants. The warm light from those places spilled onto the street, and the smell of roasted food made her stomach twist. She imagined what it must be like to eat until you were full, to not worry about tomorrow's meal, to sleep in a bed without feeling cold. But Amina was not the kind of girl to just dream and do nothing. Even though she was poor, she had a heart full of ideas. She kept thinking there must be a way to make things better, not just for herself and her mother, but for others in her neighborhood who were also struggling. She saw the tired faces of the elderly woman who lived alone, the skinny boy who always searched through trash bins for food, and the little girl who wore shoes 2 sizes too small. Their pain was familiar, and Amina wished she could help them. One day, while walking back from a cleaning job, she passed a tall, gated mansion at the edge of the city. She had seen it before, but never dared to stop. It belonged to a man she had heard about, a very rich tycoon named Gregory Hayes. People in the area spoke of him with curiosity and gossip. They said he was paralyzed from the waist down after a terrible accident years ago, and that he rarely left his home. His life, though lonely, was full of luxury. Every day, his kitchen prepared grand meals, and what was left over was simply thrown away. Amina's steps slowed as she looked at the massive iron gates. She thought about those leftovers. To Gregory, they were nothing, but to her hand, to so many hungry people, they could mean everything. An idea began to grow in her mind, small at first, but then stronger. She could ask him for the food that was being wasted. But just asking for leftovers didn't seem enough. She needed something more. Something that could make him say yes. Something that would make her different from everyone else who had ever asked him for help. That night, as she lay next to her sleeping mother, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She thought of the warm plates of food that went into the trash and the cold, empty plates on her neighbors' tables. She thought of Gregory Hayes, a man who seemed untouchable, and wondered if there was a way to reach him, not just his ears, but his heart. The idea turned into a plan, and though she didn't know exactly how it would go, Amina knew she had to try. It would take courage, and she didn't have much to lose. maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of the miracle she had been waiting for. Amina woke the next morning with the same thought she had carried through the night. The image of that towering mansion with its shining black gates would not leave her mind. She had passed by so many times before without stopping, but now it felt different. The idea inside her was no longer just a passing thought. It had turned into a mission. The streets were alive with the sound of people starting their day, vendors shouting about fresh bread, the clatter of bicycle wheels, the distant bark of a dog. Amina barely noticed any of it. She was thinking about how to approach the tycoon, Mr. Gregory Hayes. She knew the stories. Some people said he was cold and arrogant, a man who had no interest in the problems of others. Others said he used to be kind before his accident, but the bitterness of losing his ability to walk had locked him away from the world. Amina didn't know which version was true. But she knew one thing: people in his home lived in comfort, while so many outside his gates went to bed hungry. And somewhere in there, every single day, was food being thrown away. She imagined the scene: polished silver trays, golden soup bowls, bread so soft it steamed when you tore it open, fresh fruits and creamy desserts. And then she imagined it scraped into bins and carried away, while children like her walked barefoot and empty-bellied. The thought made her heart ache, but it also made her determined. That morning she wandered the streets, trying to figure out the right words. If she went there just asking for food, he might turn her away like so many others before. She needed something that would make him curious, something that sounded strange enough to make him listen. And that's when it came to her three simple words: trade leftovers for miracle. The more she thought about it, the more she liked it. It was mysterious. It didn't beg, it offered. And even though she didn't have a clear plan for what the miracle would be, she knew in her heart it had something to do with helping others. By midday, she found herself back near the mansion. The gates looked even taller than she remembered, the walls even more impossible to climb. She could see a long driveway lined with trimmed hedges and a fountain in the distance, its water glittering in the sunlight. For a moment, fear gripped her. Who was she, a poor girl in worn shoes, to walk up to a man of such wealth and power? But then she remembered her mother's face, pale, tired, and trying to hide her hunger. She remembered the neighbor's little boy digging through a trash can for a bruised apple. And she remembered that miracles didn't happen to those who waited for them, they happened to those who chased them. She took a deep breath and approached the gate. There was a camera mounted high on the wall, watching her every move. A voice crackled from a hidden speaker. "Can I help you?" Mina's voice trembled, but she forced it to be clear. "I need to speak with Mr. Hayes," she said. "It's important." There was a pause. "And who should I say is here?" the voice asked. "Amina," she replied. "Tell him I want to trade his leftovers for a miracle." Another pause. She could almost hear the disbelief in the silence. Then, to her surprise, the gates began to swing open with a slow, heavy creak. A path of perfectly laid stones led her to the front door of the mansion. She walked past manicured gardens filled with flowers she had never even seen before. The air smelled faintly of roses and warm bread, and it made her stomach twist. When she reached the door, it opened before she could knock. A tall man in a black suit, clearly a butler, stood in the doorway. His sharp eyes scanned her from head to toe. Lingering on her scuffed shoes and patched dress, "You have 5 minutes," he said curtly, stepping aside to let her in. Amina's heart pounded as she stepped onto the polished marble floor, her reflection staring back at her from its shine. She didn't know exactly what would happen next, but she knew the moment she had been waiting for all. Her life was about to begin. The marble floor beneath Amina's feet felt cold, almost slippery, as though it wasn't meant for someone like her to walk on. Her eyes darted around, taking in the mansion's vast entry hall so big it could have fit her entire house inside. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their hundreds of glittering pieces scattering light across the room like tiny stars. The air smelled faintly of something rich and buttery, the kind of scent that clung to the walls of expensive kitchens. The butler led her through the hallway without a word, his shoes tapping rhythmically against the polished tiles. Amina tried to keep her steps quiet, her hands clenched at her sides so they wouldn't tremble. As they walked, she caught glimpses into other rooms, one filled with shelves of leather-bound books, another with plush velvet chairs surrounding, a fireplace that looked like it had never burned a single log in hunger's desperation. Finally, they reached a pair of tall double doors. The butler paused, gave her a look that seemed to say, "Don't waste his time," and then pushed the doors open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, with heavy curtains drawn halfway across tall windows. In the center sat a large mahogany desk, and behind it, a man. He was dressed in a dark blue suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his hands resting calmly on the armrests of a sleek black wheelchair. This was Gregory Hayes, the tycoon she had heard so much about. His eyes, sharp and calculating, studied her the moment she entered. They were not unkind, but there was a wall in them, a distance. "So," he said slowly, his voice deep and deliberate, "you're the girl who wants to trade my leftovers for a miracle." Hearing her own strange request spoken back to her made Amina's heart race. She nodded, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Yes, sir." Gregory leaned back slightly, a small smirk forming on his lips. "I've had people come here asking for money, jobs, even a place to live, but leftovers for a miracle." He let out a low chuckle. "That's a new one." For a moment, Amina thought he might send her away, right then and there, but instead, he motioned toward a chair across from him. She hesitated, then sat, feeling the cushions sink under her slight weight. "Tell me," he continued, his tone both amused and curious, "what exactly is this miracle you're offering?" Amina swallowed. She had rehearsed lines in her head. But now, sitting before him, they felt both too small and too bold. "It's something you'll have to see for yourself," she said softly. "But I promise it's worth more than letting the food go to waste." Gregory's eyebrows lifted slightly, as though he wasn't sure whether to be intrigued or insulted. "And why should I give anything to you? You're a stranger." Amina took a breath, her voice steady this time. "Because even strangers can change each other's lives. Maybe I can change yours. Or maybe you can change mine. But nothing changes if you say no." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Gregory's smirk faded, replaced by something else, a flicker of interest, or maybe a memory he wasn't ready to share. He leaned forward just a little, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "You have 1 month," he said at last. "Every day, my staff will give you whatever's left after meals. In return, I expect to see this so-called miracle. If I'm not impressed, this arrangement ends." Amina nodded quickly, relief and excitement mixing in her chest. "Thank you, sir." Gregory waved his hand toward the door. "Don't thank me yet. I'm only doing this because I'm curious. And curiosity fades fast." As she left the room, the butler gave her another long look, half skeptical, half warning. But Amina didn't care. The first step had been taken. Now, the miracle had to begin. The first day Amina came to collect the leftovers, Gregory Hayes was already waiting in the dining room. Rather, he was there out of habit. He always had lunch at exactly 1 o'clock. The long table before him was set with enough food to feed 10 people. Roasted lamb glistening under the soft light, golden potatoes sprinkled with herbs, steaming bread rolls, and a bowl of fresh fruit that looked like it had been painted by an artist. Amina stood at the doorway, unsure if she was supposed to step closer. The butler, Mr. Clark, motioned for her to wait. Gregory took his time eating, his fork and knife moving in precise, almost mechanical motions. He didn't look at her, as if she were just part of the furniture. When he finally pushed his plate away, Mr. Clark began clearing the table. He placed the untouched dishes food that would have gone straight to the bin to a neat box and handed it to Amina. She held it close, the warmth of the food seeping into her cold fingers. Gregory finally glanced her way, his expression unreadable. "There you go," he said, his tone casual but edged with something else. "Your miracle starts now, I suppose." Amina gave a small nod. "It will." He gave a short laugh, almost under his breath. "I'll believe it when I see it." That first week, the exchange was always the same. She would arrive, wait quietly while he finished his meal, collect the leftovers, and leave. Gregory rarely spoke to her, though sometimes he would watch her from the corner of his eye, as if trying to figure out what she was really up to. On the fifth day, curiosity got the better of him. "What do you do with it?" he asked suddenly. As she turned to go, she paused, hugging the food box to her chest. "You'll see," she said, offering nothing more. His lips curved in a faint smirk. "Mysterious little thing, aren't you?" Amina didn't answer. She simply walked away, her steps quick but steady. Later that evening, Gregory sat alone in his study, staring at the fireplace. For years, he had lived in a world of routine meals, meetings, and silence. People came to him either to do business or to ask for something. They always had an angle, always a reason that benefited themselves. But this girl, she was different. She hadn't asked for money, hadn't begged for work. She had made an odd bargain and kept her promise of secrecy. He told himself he didn't care what she was doing. And yet, he found himself looking forward to the next day and the day after that. By the second week, Gregory began testing her. One afternoon, he had the kitchen prepare something unusual, delicate pastries filled with spiced cream and dusted with powdered sugar. He watched as Amina's eyes widened ever so slightly when she saw them. Still, she didn't ask for a bite or sneak one for herself. She took the box, thanked Mr. Clark, and left. That night, Gregory caught himself wondering if she had eaten any of it, or if she had given it all away. The thought unsettled him not because he cared about the food, but because he realized he wanted to know the answer. On the third week, a rainy Thursday, she arrived soaked to the bone. Water dripped from her hair, her thin dress clinging to her arms. Gregory noticed her shiver as she stood in the doorway, but she said nothing. He could have offered her a towel, a seat by the fire, even a hot drink. Instead, he let Mr. Clark hand her the food and send her on her way. He told himself it wasn't his place to get involved, but something in him was shifting. Even if he refused to admit it, the laughter he had given her on their first meeting was still there, but it was changing. It wasn't the mocking kind anymore. 'Twas the kind a man gives when he's trying to hide the fact that he's beginning to care. And though Gregory Hayes didn't know it yet, Amina's quiet persistence was already pulling at the walls. He had spent years building around his heart. Asterisk, by the fourth week, Gregory Hayes could no longer pretend he wasn't curious. Every day the girl came at the same time, collected the leftovers without fuss, and disappeared into the streets like a shadow. She never lingered, never looked around the mansion, never asked for anything more. And that baffled him. In Gregory's world, people always wanted more. They took what you gave them and still reached for the rest. But Amina? She took only what had been agreed upon. That strange promise, trade leftovers for a miracle, still echoed in his mind. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, Gregory made up his mind. He called Mr. Clark to his study. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice low but firm, "you're going to follow her." The butler raised an eyebrow. "Follow her, sir?" "Yes. I want to know what she's doing with the food. But don't let her see you. If she finds out, the game's up." Mr. Clark hesitated but nodded. "Understood." The next day, after the usual exchange, Amina stepped out of the mansion gates with the box of food. She walked quickly through the streets, her steps light but purposeful. She didn't head toward the busier parts of town. Instead, she slipped into the narrow back lanes where broken fences leaned against crumbling walls. Gregory waited in his study, pretending to read, but in truth, his thoughts were far from the page. When Mr. Clark returned hours later, his usually composed expression was softer, almost unsettled. "Well?" Gregory asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Mr. Clark set the empty food box on the desk. "She didn't keep a single bite for herself." Gregory's brow furrowed. "Go on." "She went to the old community center on Miller Street, the one that's barely standing. Inside, there were at least 20 people waiting. Children, elderly folk, a few men who looked like they'd been sleeping rough for weeks. She unpacked everything you gave her and served them one by one. No rush, no pushing. They treated her like—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Like family." Gregory was silent for a moment, his fingers tracing the smooth edge of the box. After that, she stayed until everyone had eaten. Then she sat with them, laughing, talking, listening. When it was all over, she helped clean up before walking home, alone, empty-handed. Gregory leaned back in his wheelchair, staring at the ceiling. He didn't know what he had been expecting, maybe that she was selling the food or trading it for favors. But this was pure. The next day, Gregory decided he needed to see it for himself. He couldn't shake the image Mr. Clark had painted: the girl in her worn dress, standing among the forgotten and the hungry, handing out food with the grace of someone who had more to give than anyone in the room. So, after she left, Gregory had his driver follow her from a distance. The car rolled slowly behind her down the winding streets, the city changing with every turn, glossy storefronts fading into peeling paint and broken sidewalks. When they stopped near the community center, Gregory stayed in the car, watching through the rain-speckled window, and there she was, Amina, smiling as she handed a steaming bread roll to a boy with bare feet. She bent down to talk to an old man who clutched a blanket around his shoulders, then gently brushed crumbs from a little girl's cheek. The sight stirred something deep in Gregory's chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't guilt. It was recognition. Recognition of the hunger, not just for food, but for dignity. Recognition of the way small acts could carry a weight greater than gold. For the first time in years, Gregory felt his chest tighten in a way that wasn't from loneliness or pain, was from the quiet, uncomfortable realization that he wanted to be part of something again. And in that moment, he understood one thing. Whatever miracle Amina had promised him, it was already happening. Gregory Hayes had lived behind walls for so long, walls of marble, steel, and silence, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to look forward to something. But now, every day, he found himself listening for the faint creak of the mansion gates, knowing it meant Amina had arrived. He never told her he had followed her. He never told her that he'd seen the community center and the faces of the people she fed. But after that rainy afternoon, something in him shifted. He began paying closer attention to the food that left his table. If there were just scraps, he told the chef to prepare extra portions. If the bread was a day old, he had fresh rolls baked. He didn't explain why, he simply said, "Make it better, make it more." And the chef, though puzzled, obeyed. At first, Amina didn't notice. She simply accepted what she was given, thanked Mr. Clark, and disappeared into the streets. But Gregory noticed. He watched from the dining room window as she walked away, her small figure vanishing into the city. He imagined her arriving at the community center, opening the box, and seeing something unexpected: roast chicken instead of leftover stew, a tray of rich chocolate pastries instead of plain bread. He wondered if it made her smile by the second. Weak of this quiet change, Gregory began adding things himself. From his private pantry, he'd select jars of honey, packets of tea, or tins of imported biscuits, luxuries most of the people she fed had probably never tasted. He would place them at the top of the box, knowing they would catch her eye first. He told himself it was simply part of the arrangement, part of testing her promise. But deep down, he knew it was something else. Still, Gregory never asked her about it. He didn't want to break the spell of her secrecy. Instead, he let the mystery keep him company at night. Lying in bed, he'd find his mind drifting back to the image of her among those people, her hands moving with quiet care, her laughter breaking through the heavy air of poverty. One evening, as he sat by the window with a cup of tea, Gregory caught himself imagining what his own life might have been like if someone like Amina had walked into it years ago, before the accident, before the bitterness, before the isolation. The thought was strange, almost unsettling, but it lingered. Then something happened that broke the quiet rhythm. They had fallen into. It was late afternoon when Mr. Clark returned from running errands, a folded newspaper under his arm. He placed it on Gregory's desk without comment. Gregory wasn't one to care for local news, but something on the front page caught his eye, a grainy black and white photo of the old community center. And there, in the middle of the frame, was Amina, smiling as she served food to a crowd of children. The headline read, "Young Girl Brings Hope to Forgotten Streets." Gregory felt an unexpected surge of pride, as though she were somehow his own doing. He traced the edge of the photograph with his finger, noticing details the reporter hadn't written about: the way her hair was damp with sweat from working, the small tilt of her head as she listened to someone speak, the way her body leaned forward in genuine care. That night, called Mr. Clark into the study. "Tomorrow," Gregory said, "we're not just sending leftovers." The butler tilted his head. "Sir." Gregory's eyes were sharp, decisive now. "I want a hot meal cooked from scratch, not for everyone at that center. I want it delivered in the best containers we have. No paper boxes, no scraps. Real food, good food." Mr. Clark hesitated. "Should I tell her it's from you?" Gregory thought for a long moment, then shook his head. "No. Let her think it's part of the leftovers. The miracle isn't mine, it's hers. I just want to see it grow." And so, the next day, when Amina lifted the lid of the box, she found not just a few saved portions, but a feast: freshly baked bread, creamy soup in sealed jars, roasted vegetables, and a rich dessert that smelled of cinnamon and butter. Her eyes widened in surprise, but she said nothing, only murmured a quiet thank you before heading off. Gregory watched from the window until she turned the corner and disappeared, a small smile playing on his lips. He didn't know it yet, but the miracle she had promised was no longer just for the people she fed, it was happening inside him too. The month had nearly come to an end. Gregory had counted the days without meaning to, watching them slip away like pages torn from a calendar. What had started as a curious little arrangement had turned into something that occupied his thoughts. From the moment he woke to the moment he closed his eyes at night, he told himself he still didn't know exactly what the miracle was, but he knew enough to sense it was bigger than food, bigger than charity. There was something in the way Amina carried herself, in the quiet determination of her steps, that told him she was building something far more lasting than a full stomach. One morning, instead of waiting at home, Gregory made a decision. He told Mr. Clark to ready the car. "Where to, sir?" the butler asked, though he already had an idea. "Miller Street," Gregory said simply. The drive was long, winding away from the polished parts of the city into streets where the air felt heavier, the paint peeled from walls, and laughter was rare. When the car finally stopped, Gregory saw the old community center, its bricks cracked, its windows fogged but alive. Alive in a way that took him by surprise. From his seat, he could see Amina outside, arranging chairs beneath a sagging awning. Her thin hands moved quickly, setting the scene for what looked less like a food handout and more like a gathering, a place where people came not only to eat, but to belong. He watched as she greeted each person by name. An old woman with trembling hands received a gentle hug. A young boy clutching a broken toy grinned as she knelt to admire it. A man with tired eyes left with a loaf of bread cradled like something precious. And through it all, Amina never stopped smiling, not the fake kind, but the kind that made. Her whole face light up. Gregory's driver offered to help him out of the car, but he shook his head. "Not yet," he said. He wanted to watch without being seen, to witness this miracle as it was, untouched by his presence. As the food from the mansion was unpacked, he saw the way people's faces lit up, eyes widening at the smell of fresh soup, the sight of roasted vegetables still steaming, the golden crust of bread that cracked softly under gentle fingers. Gregory recognized every dish. They were the ones he'd ordered for her in secret, the ones he had insisted be made with care. But the food was only half of it. After the meal, instead of letting everyone drift away, Amina gathered them into a circle. She handed out books. For the children, small sewing kits for the women, and warm scarves for the men. Gregory's eyes narrowed. Where had she gotten these things? He quickly realized she must have used whatever little she earned from her odd jobs to buy them. For an hour, the group laughed, talked, and shared stories. The center felt less like a charity and more like a family kitchen. The air thick with warmth that had nothing to do with the weather. Gregory felt something inside him stir and ache that was not pain, but memory. It had been so long since he had felt part of anything. So long since he had been in a room where people cared for one another without expecting something in return. And now, sitting in his car on a broken street, he found himself wanting to be part of this. Eventually, he asked the driver to take him closer. The car rolled forward, and when it stopped, Amina looked up in surprise. She wiped her hands on her skirt and walked toward him, her face a mixture of confusion and shy pride. "You came," she said softly. "I came," he replied. His voice felt different, less guarded, almost warm. "I wanted to see the miracle." Amina smiled, and for a moment she seemed to shine brighter than the sun. "It's not my miracle," she said. "It's theirs. I just helped it grow." Gregory looked past her at the people still gathered, their laughter spilling into the street. And for the first time in years, he felt his chest loosen, as if the air he breathed was lighter. He realized the miracle wasn't only in front of him, it was inside him too. Gregory Hayes had spent years watching life from behind his mansion walls, a spectator to the world he no longer felt connected to. But as he sat in the car that day, looking at the faces inside the community center, something inside him shifted for good. He didn't just want to watch anymore. He wanted to belong. He turned to his driver. "Help me inside," he said. The driver hesitated. "Sir, the ground's uneven." "It might be help me inside," Gregory repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. A minute later, he was rolling through the doorway of the community center. The room fell quiet for a moment, as if his presence had pulled the air. Still. Then, one by one, the people began to smile, nodding in greeting. There was no fear in their eyes, no discomfort, only curiosity and warmth. The kind he hadn't felt in decades. Amina hurried to his side. "You didn't have to. I did," Gregory interrupted gently. His voice was softer now, but firm. "If I'm part of this miracle, I should see it up close." She grinned, stepping aside so he could see the room better. Children peeked out from behind chairs, giggling. An old man raised his cup of soup toward Gregory in a silent toast. Someone strummed a worn guitar in the corner, filling the air with a slow, gentle tune. Gregory looked around, his gaze settling on the table where the food had been laid out. Empty trays, licked clean bowls, and satisfied faces told him everything. He needed to know his food had done more than fill bellies. It had created moments. It had restored dignity. He motioned for Amina to come closer. "You kept your word," he said. "You promised a miracle, and you gave me one." Amina shook her head. "No, Mr. Hayes, you gave them one. I just carried." It here, the words struck something deep in him. For years, Gregory had believed his wealth and his life were locked behind gates untouchable, unreachable. Yet here was proof that even something as simple as leftovers could ripple outward and touch more lives than he'd ever imagined. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the room. "From today forward," he announced, "this place will never run out of food again. And it won't just be food, you'll have what you need to live, to work, to dream." A hush fell over the room. Then came the murmurs, the gasps, and finally, applause, not polite applause, but the kind that comes from hearts swelling with hope. Gregory turned to Amina. "And you," he said, "will run it all. If you can create this with scraps, I want to see what you can do with everything." For a moment, Amina just stood there, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open. Then tears welled up and spilled down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that her small dream had just grown into something far bigger than herself. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the crumbling rooftops, Gregory sat by the open door of the center, watching families leave with full stomachs and lighter hearts. He realized something profound. Amina hadn't just fed the hungry, she had fed him too. Not with bread or soup, but with something he thought he had lost forever: purpose. And in that fading golden light, Gregory Hayes, the man who had once laughed at the idea of trading leftovers for a miracle, understood the truth. Miracles weren't always grand or magical. Sometimes they were just the result of one brave soul deciding to try.